Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a little troubleshooting I need to do. And in the comments of my videos, I've even had some people comment on a couple of my in progress situations in terms of, you know, hey, you got to get the worms out of there and you got to set them up in a new bin. Luckily I've got a couple new bins over here on standby, so if I really needed to evacuate my worms out of any one of my systems, and I've certainly got a place to put them. And I just thought I would really quickly grab my camera here and try to capture here what I'm doing to address the situations in the two bins that I'm referring to. So one of them is a bin that we last checked in on 6 days ago, and it was 6 days ago that I decided it was time to initiate the migration of the worms out of what I was considering the finished castings over into a feeding area, fresh bedding, fresh food. But the only issue with this material is that it's way overly damp, very muddy and clumped together. So I left it uncovered last time we were in this bin. I've even gone so far as to try to move some air across the top to see if it'll help with the drying and the evaporation. The one thing I'm noticing is a tremendous number of dead worms all over the place. I'm not really sure what to make of this situation. But since it's been 6 days, I figured it's time to check in on how things are progressing in here. See if I can come up with any bright ideas for how to try to stabilize the situation in this bin. The other one is a little bit more recent. I had recently finished my 2 African nightcrawler worm bins that I had a lot of mites in. And what I ended up with was a bunch of castings, which I assumed had a lot of cocoons in them, so all the harvested castings ended up in sort of a nursery bin that I created over here. So the whole idea of this is to just allow time for any cocoons in the material to hatch, and then eventually I'll be able to, you know, round them all up and move them into something else. And then the castings might even be usable by then. Maybe the mites that inhabit the environment will have diminished some. So we'll see about that. But the bin that I've got issues in is the bin into which I had launched all of the worms that were the result of me harvesting those 2 systems. And I was trying to eliminate the mites that I mentioned earlier by creating a creating a layer on the top of the freshly built bin that consisted of a great deal of the diatomaceous earth. It's the stuff that you see right here on the shelf. It's a sort of a natural pesticide which physically, you know, kills insects. But I had used so much of this stuff that the bin was evidently just way too dry because of this stuff. And when I came in here yesterday, the worms had not submerged down into the bedding. They were all just mounded up in a big pile, you know, trying to survive because they didn't feel that it was possible to dive down into the material due to the diatomaceous earth being spread across the top. So I'm very happy to say that the measures I took yesterday seem to have worked. So first thing I did was I took the mound of worms and I pushed them down into the lower reaches of the material where I knew there was, you know, damp bedding and there was food and grit and everything else. It was just the top layers that I had placed onto the container. The dry leaves, the dry diatomaceous earth. You can see a little bit of it remaining here. But yesterday I came in here, besides moving the worms down into the damp material down below, I also came in here with a squirt bottle and I moistened the top layer, and then I went ahead and I covered up the whole thing with the plastic. And the plastic is always going to sort of force the recirculation of whatever moisture is in the bin. Obviously not letting it evaporate. Keeps all the moisture in the bin, so all the moisture that's in here is now sort of equalizing, making any dry materials damp, some of the damp materials sharing their moisture with the rest of the stuff in the bin. So in my book, this situation has been stabilized and is under control now. It was a little bit scary though in the beginning because I did create a very hostile environment for the poor worms. And I got a lot of comments and feedback, so I appreciate all that from everyone. And I even did follow some of the advice that I received early when people started observing the issue. So again, thanks to all the viewers, but I'm still faced with this in progress horizontal migration. I've not yet seen how many worms managed to make it over into this side of the bin, and that's fine, whatever has occurred here. Typically after a number of days like this, I'll just reinforce the food supply in one of these migration zones, but I've got to come up with some sort of an idea on coping with what's happening over here. So I'm going to put on a glove and we'll get to work here. Oh yes, a little bit of disclosure as well. When we first arrived, you saw that the bin was uncovered. There was a fan trying to help dry the material here on the surface. And 6 days ago, when we last checked in on this bin together in my video showing the initiation of this horizontal migration, then too the material was left uncovered. But I've got to admit, there was a period of time for a number of days between then and now when I did actually have this plastic covering across the whole surface. For whatever reason, I just sort of kept flip-flopping back and forth on what's best here. And for whatever reason, I second-guessed the whole idea of trying to promote drying in here. And I did cover things up here. Not sure if that was part of the undoing of the environment in this bin. But I just figured I'd mention it because I always get good feedback, and I just want to be, you know, completely honest with what's happening here, so I'm not misleading anybody. And you know, just trying to leverage the knowledge of the audience if possible. But let me just really quickly outline what my thinking here was. Number one is, I think that if there's a way that I can get the moisture level in here to drop a little bit, it might help the material get a little bit more crumbly. So my idea was to maybe try to gently till up the material and incorporate maybe a few larger chunks of dry cardboard in here, which might act as a sponge. The other idea was to try to prevent this from becoming an obstacle so that the worms that do make it at least this far can just get over into the new feeding area. But I'm also questioning how effective this feeding area has been, because it just doesn't feel as damp as it normally would be. So weird, right? Because you would think it would be completely drenched and full of worms, but I'm looking in here already and I see a whole bunch of dead worms in here too. Jeez Louise. This is like carnage. What a shame, because this bin was so much fun. It was just a few weeks ago that the material was nice and loose and you could tell it was just jam-packed with tons and tons of worms. I'm starting to worry if I've, you know, really sort of poisoned them or created an environment so hostile for them that they've just been unable to survive. This is really turning into something of a mess. And you know, I try to be as straightforward and honest in my videos as possible. I try not to mask issues or come across like I'm the know-it-all. In fact, I mean, the whole idea of my channel from the very beginning has always been to basically share my current situation and ultimately seek the input of the viewers, who I assume are always going to have more experience and knowledge than me, to kind of steer me in the right direction. So if I'm dealing with a real sticky situation here, I'm not going to try to pretend it's all fine if it's not. But I mean, you could see some dead worms here, and I'm starting to sense the odor of a not very healthy environment over here too. This is not good. Usually at this point, after 6 days, you would have a good number of worms already having made it pretty close to the feeding area. Tons and tons of worms within the feeding area. Oh my goodness. This is not good. Not good at all. And I don't mean to laugh, because it's certainly not funny. But I mean, what we're dealing with here is basically a worm graveyard. I don't know what the heck happened here, folks. This is somewhat shocking. I've never experienced this before, so I don't know exactly what happened, but the worms all came over for the nice dampness and food. Maybe not so much for the dampness, because dampness is in, you know, it's totally overload here in terms of dampness in this bin, but whatever's going on in this feeding area is totally hostile to the worms and appears to have killed pretty much all of them. I mean, if there's a couple that are still sort of squirming around and surviving here, it's good for them, but they're probably just barely hanging on at this point. Oh my goodness. Not good at all. I mean, I'm going to cover it up because you're kind of lucky that this is not smell-o-vision, because it is pretty stinky. Luckily, it's not so terrible that I've got to just run outside with the bin, but it is pretty stinky. I'm almost feeling like I should just take this stuff outside and just dump it on the ground, and if any worms can sort of survive this hostile space and make their way down into the earth and survive, then that might just be their only way out of this terrible situation I've created here. I mean, I could already see down low over there, it just looked like more kind of like a worm soup down there, just like partially decomposed worms piled down into a little puddle on the bottom. I don't even know how many are still surviving in here. A couple are kind of moving around a little bit. I mean, another idea I had yesterday, which might actually work, was to just completely fill this bin with water and try to melt all of this casting material and sort of just dissolve it all so that it's not clumps anymore. It would just be sort of a broth, basically. And then any worms that are sort of caught up in this stuff would be, you know, released and freed. And then, and then I would just, you know, again, probably just dump it down in the dirt out in my garden, and hopefully some of them survive. But I can already see that many of them will not. This is really a huge shame, because this was what I had been for the longest time touting as my most busy, highest populated bin. And I think, you know, mainly due to my negligence or whatever, I let things really go south in here. And I'm going to try to use this as a warning, some sort of a, you know, indicator to me that I've got to really check on my other bins here, the ones that are still using plastic coverings, and maybe the moisture level is just getting exceedingly too high and dangerous in those bins too, but I've never seen this before in any of my bins. I don't know what the heck happened here. But I'd really like to try to do what I can to let the remaining surviving worms in here have a chance. And the only thing that comes to mind at this point is to just totally fill this tub with water, hopefully just melting the castings themselves. And then maybe I can even come in here and sort of stir it and break it up a little bit. Not sure if this is going to work, but it's the only thing that comes to mind, and I'm definitely gravitating towards taking that approach at this point. And then hopefully I'll have some worms that survive this ordeal, and they'll be free to live out in my garden. And then if there's any cocoons in here too, I guess they'll be, you know, hopefully still capable of emerging into the world and hatching and becoming new baby worms. Oh my goodness, this is such a mess. So I apologize to anyone who's watching this and, you know, kind of sharing in the distress that these poor worms are experiencing. It was certainly unintentional. It was just my intention to help the worms move out of these finished castings into a new space so I could relocate them. But it feels to me like I've basically just done in a couple thousand completely healthy and happy worms. So I think I'm going to head outside. I'll bring the camera along. We're going to just, I don't know. We're just going to go ahead and we're going to fill this tub up with water. I'll pull out all these larger scraps of stuff. And my hope is that I can just dissolve all of this casting material to the point where any worms caught up in it are free of it. I'll even help a little bit by stirring it around. Then I'm going to dump it in the garden. I don't know what else to do. And I know that by the time I get comments and feedback and advice and suggestions, it'll be too late to change my path here. So I hope I didn't miss an opportunity to, recover from this. But nothing else comes to mind, so I'm just going to follow through with this. It's the only humane thing I can think of offhand to try to save what few worms appear to still be moving and surviving in here, and probably barely. So let's do that. Let's head outside with this stuff and try to save whatever worms are still alive in here. Give them a chance at living outside in my garden. Ugh. So I'm out here in my garden. What you see behind me is the trellis that I grow up all my tomatoes and plants up. I like to do the suspended method of, running the vines up strings. But we're not here to talk gardening. We're here to talk about this poor bin. I've got my garden hose all set to go. I'm going to pick out all of these scraps of cardboard and food and everything, and then we'll just proceed to try to dissolve all of this chunky casting material, hopefully freeing up any worms that might still survive in here. And then I'm just going to release everything down on the ground out into my garden. Poor worms. So I've already observed a couple flies coming over, sensing the stench of death, I guess, looking to find a place to lay their eggs. I've shooed them away. I guess all I'm really after here is getting any worms that are still stuck to this material off, not knowing if they're alive or dead. Trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Hopefully they're still alive and have a chance at surviving still. So maybe I'll just do a quick rinse of any place I see what appears to be a worm. Can't tell if some of them are clearly no longer alive. Some of them it's a bit difficult to tell. This is truly unfortunate. And I usually hope that I've got good, positive stories to tell here on my channel, but I believe there's also a lot to learn from making mistakes. You know what they say about making mistakes and not learning from them. So I'm just sharing my mistakes with the audience here to let people see what could go wrong. And I can't really even tell you in terms of like forensically what the heck it is that happened here. I'm sure some people probably already have a sense of what happened here and can probably explain it better than I could. So I hopefully am able to learn from this and not repeat this. This is definitely the first time I've observed anything like this in any of my bins. I mean, I had one occasion where I had a container full of worm castings that I had accidentally allowed the lid to close shut on, and then it seemed to me like the airflow had simply ceased in that container, and then things went anaerobic. So I was attesting a similar situation in that bin to a sort of an anaerobic environment, or maybe just lack of airflow causing the worms to pretty much all die. So when I opened up that container of castings, it just had that foul stench of death. Certainly worse than I'm seeing here. So here, I'm sure it could have gotten a lot worse if I had not noticed it. So in a way, I'm glad that I came in here after 6 days to see how things are progressing. There again, no real particular reason for the 6-day interval. It's just that I've been sort of using the 6-day interval in my bins that I'm striving towards harvest in to do my check-ins. I guess you know why, because so far my record for getting a horizontal migration successfully completed is 18 days. So I keep thinking that if I check in after the first 6 days, maybe check in after the next 6 days, after 12 days, and then maybe on the third check-in I would already at least match the 18-day completion of a horizontal migration of the worms. I knew I wasn't going to see that sort of results in here because of the dampness of the material, and I think that's probably also the main cause of the problem here, is just the excess dampness. So whatever, I'm glad it was, you know, not 10 days or more. Maybe we would have seen even worse situation in here if we had waited longer. So I mean, bear with me while I carefully try to rescue any worms from possibly being on any of this material before I proceed to trying to dissolve the castings in this tub. You know, I will be stirring the contents of the tub around, so I am somewhat regretting the fact that these gloves have torn and I've got a big hole on my fingertip here. I'm going to be getting my hands a little bit gross with this sort of worm stew here, but whatever, I could just rinse it off and I can get back to my life. Fortunately for a lot of these worms, it's not an option for them. Some of this stuff is the food that was used to set the feeding zone up, and it is deteriorating here, so some of it is kind of mush. Now, anybody who's kind of worried that these worms are drowning, so to speak, in here, I mean, I'm just going to share what I have heard. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's my understanding that since the worms do breathe through their skin, they're not dependent on the air. They're just looking for the dissolved oxygen within the moisture that touches their skin, and that's how they sort of get the oxygen that they need. So I've actually heard that if worms are within, let's say for example, like water that's in an aquarium, then they can actually be submerged within that type of water that's got like a bubbler going on. They can actually survive quite well in aerated water. So I'm not going to say that the water coming out of my hose is aerated like it would be in a fish tank or an aquarium, but I would imagine that there is a certain amount of dissolved oxygen within any water that the worms can survive on for a period of time. So I'm sure that in the few minutes that we're going to be submerging some worms underwater, they're going to do just fine, and I'm not worried about it. So if anyone knows better on this topic, then I'd be interested in hearing what the actual story is. Not that it's going to help these worms at that point, but still, I do a lot of the things I do based on what I've heard and read, and I also try to take into account the fact that not everything I've heard and read is always all going to be true. I mean, some of this mush can probably just sort of blend in with the food, with the castings at this point. I'm just looking to fish out any larger chunks of bedding that I don't want to litter my garden with. Although I could certainly pick it all out of the garden later, so I shouldn't worry too much about it. I'm just thinking that some of these larger chunks are not going to dissolve the way the castings are gonna. So I think we've picked out the majority of the stuff in here. So I guess I'm just gonna proceed with trying to, see if I could sort of make this into just more of a collection of dissolved castings. It's funny, one of my viewers, her name is Marjorie, has often suggested taking my finished castings and trying to do sort of one of these dissolve tests to see how much of the material actually dissolves. So then you'll know that it's true castings. Anything that does dissolve is going to be actual castings, as opposed to anything that does not dissolve and then kind of sinks to the bottom of your solution. That would give you a sense of how much stuff did actually get converted into castings, how much of it didn't. Never imagined that this would be my first try at that. So I don't think I've got to dissolve all of it into a big muddy mess.
I think as long as I can sort of just feel like the majority of it is pretty loose, that the worms can free themselves from it, then it's mission accomplished. I can't wait to hear the comments on this video. People are going to be outraged at my irresponsible treatment of these poor worms, and I deserve it. I'll admit it, I deserve it. Oops. I certainly hope I didn't miss an opportunity to take a better approach at trying to save these poor little guys. This was the only thing that came to mind, and I felt like I just had to act. I didn't want to just sit around and wait for ideas to come in. I just wanted to do something. So hopefully this ends up allowing some of the poor little worms in this material to survive. Like a little kid playing in the mud. It's like a worm graveyard, unfortunately. I guess the other thing I could do is after I dump this on the ground, I can continue to sort of spray it down to try further dissolving the material a little bit so that no worms get caught up in it. But it really is starting to feel like I've pretty much broken up all the larger lumps, and it's all kind of becoming sort of a consistent muddy material. I'm sure if I just left it for a minute or two, it would further dissolve. Maybe that's what I should do. I should just give this a minute or two to let some of the material really soak in some of the water and dissolve. I'll give it one more stir to try to break any remaining chunks up. And then we'll try to release these poor little guys into the earth. So let's give this some time to soak. Well, it's been a few minutes now that this solution here has been soaking. You can see some worms that are kind of coming up to the surface and squirming around, sort of swimming around. I don't think you can really say that worms can swim per se. But I've in the meantime, I've gone out into the garage and grabbed a rake, and I tried to create a little landing pad for this. I figured I would use some of this grass clipping that I had been using as mulch layer across the top of my garden as a little bit of a weed barrier to try to cover up this with at the end. So I think we're going to proceed to the releasing of the worms, so to speak. Usually it's kind of a celebrated event on my channel, but in this case it's a little bit more of a somber event. But let's go ahead and move the camera over to where I'm going to spill this material out on the ground and try to bring an end to this ordeal for these poor little worms. Okay, well, here goes nothing. I guess whatever plants end up in these couple spots here in my garden are going to get like a supercharged dose of worm casting in their diet. So see if we can gradually pour this out without creating a huge mess. I guess I'm gonna have to rinse this out a little bit. Let's get the hose going. Does appear to me like we got the majority of it out. Let's see if we can come down closer and give the castings a little bit of a helping hand here to dissolve. Perhaps I can get the rake over here and spread this stuff out a little bit. try not to harm any worms in the process. I can only imagine what some of you must be thinking about me at this point. What an idiot. What a buffoon. How could he let this happen? I'm definitely curious to see what the comments for this video are going to look like. There's certainly not a lot of worms to be seen, that's for sure. I'm not sure if it's a combination of the bright sunlight kind of triggering their instant reaction of diving down into the material. My only hope is that they can all get to a safe spot, at least those that have survived, quickly. And I hope there was a good number of them that made it through the ordeal. Looks like we've got all the worms out of the container. Maybe I'll give it another zap with the garden hose here. I can certainly see some squirmy activity here and there. See some worms that are managing to free themselves from the thick, gooey castings that are surrounding them. My hope is that the moisture level is enough to, you know, allow them to squirm free of the material that they're inhabiting. That they could take cover down in the dirt below. But there's really not much more to be done here, I think, so that's pretty much the end of the video. I'll take care of cleaning everything else up around here and putting things away, but that's boring. I'm not going to take your time with that. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, give me a thumbs up. If you think I deserve a thumbs down, then by all means, please feel free to give me one of those too. I've deserved it, if that's what I get. But hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Thanks everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.